You thought about why laws come at where they do in the Old Testament? Like, it bothered rabbis to say, if the book was all about law, why is it that we have all of this narrative prior to the giving of the law? If that's the story, if the story is about people getting to Sinai, getting the covenant, getting the land, then what's all this other stuff about? And that's what changed the game for me. Is Abraham gets called out, and then immediately after that, he goes down into Egypt in chapter 12. He goes down into Egypt. God will hit Pharaoh with plagues. And as a result, though, he will walk out with an abundance. We've heard that story before, but we can just see it for what the text says and not, oh, I got to make sure I see the science add up.
Hello everyone, this is what your pastor didn't tell you. Today I'm on with Ben Pate. We're going to be talking about the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy, how it's one cohesive whole. We're also going to talk about Adam as Israel, how Adam relates to Israel, and some extremely fascinating parts of the Genesis text. Ben, how are you doing today? Can you give us a little bit of your background, education, what you do for a living, all that kind of stuff?
You bet. So, hey, thanks for having me on, man. This is a lot of fun. I love doing this. So my name is Ben Pate. I have a PhD in Old Testament, and I pastor. That's my my job. I am a pastor at Royal Palms Baptist Church here in Phoenix, Arizona. When I grew up overseas, I was a missionary kid. Came back, went to seminary. Kind of thought I was just going to do the pastor track only. And what happened to me, which leads up to where we're at today, is I went to this Genesis class, and I went to this Bible class kind of assuming that I knew it and had studied. Parents had taught me the Bible, my dad being a pastor and all of that, kind of thought I knew the Bible well. And I sat in this class by Genesis by a guy named John Sailhammer. And that was the beginning of the journey, man. I went into this class and my mind was blown because I finally was challenged to really begin to see the Bible in terms of a unity of a text and trying to understand it, and really blew my mind, instead of seeing things in terms of the arguments of old earth versus young earth, but to see it like just what is the text pointing to us, even in Genesis. And so it took that, and then I was hooked. I started telling him, man, I'll do whatever. And I'll follow you around. I want to do a PhD with you, all of that. So I just spent every waking moment I could. And when I was at seminary with him, I would follow him to his office. And so I started that journey to do a PhD. And what happened for me, by the way, is finished up my MDiv at Golden Gate Baptist Theological Seminary. Was going to start my PhD in Old Testament with John Sailhammer. And what happened was, the first week of me being his PhD student, he ended up going on medical disability. He had Parkinson's, and that was the end of his teaching at Golden Gate. But we stayed in touch still, and I was with the Sailhammer family still until he passed away. But I ended up getting into seminary to the PhD program, starting to do the Old Testament. Kind of had to figure out, like, God, why did you bring me here? And what am I here for now? Because I spent all my time in the MDiv with John, and now trying to figure out, what do I do? But it was interesting. A good friend of mine now, who became a mentor of mine, one of the Old Testament profs there, got me hooked on thinking about dreams in the Bible. And growing up as a guy on the mission field, especially in Islamic countries, there are a lot of stories about people who came to know Jesus through dreams. And so that really changed kind of the trajectory of what I ended up studying. So I ended up doing my dissertation on dream narratives as they appear in the Old Testament, and dealt with those, and still stayed with most of my stuff being in the Pentateuch, because most of those dreams are there, with a couple outside of it. And but that's kind of my background. So I spent most of my time in the Pentateuch, and like I said, with me, I took everything I could with Sailhammer, and even so, I'll show you. Here's how much people used to make fun of me how much I have a whole Sailhammer shelf up here. I stole this off I didn't steal this off the door. The school gave it to me after he was after he left. They still had on the wall, and I was like, "Can I have that?" And they said, "Yes, you can." So it's like it's my Sailhammer shelf up there. But he and the Sailhammer family were good friends up to me, and so once like I said, man, once I started with him, and I just couldn't stop wanting to study the Old Testament. And for me, doing the Pentateuch, Zach, my mind went from, it used to be a book about laws and make sure you keep the law, kind of that same view that a lot of people have of like it's just about laws, keep it, make sure you do it, to like saying like, no, it's actually about our failure to keep the law and our need for a savior. And so that changed the game for me, and it's lit a passion for me to teach the Old Testament. So I adjunct as well when I get a chance to here in Phoenix at Grand Canyon and Wayland Baptist University, but primarily get to teach this. And so, hey, that's a long, I told you, man, it's going to take me a long time to land the plane, but I did. So there you go. There's a little bit about me.
Yeah, no. And definitely one of the reasons you're on here is because you have a great understanding of, Seth Postel and John Sailhammer's work. And it's just so fascinating to me. One of those books that really make you think.
Yeah.
And it's just like, I've never thought about that way. So kind of on that topic, and in modern scholarship today, we have this idea of like, documentary hypothesis that there's all these different writers of the first 5 books of the Bible. It's not just Moses, like, your typical Sunday school teacher told you. And, but, John Sailhammer took a different approach. He saw, hey, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, is one cohesive narrative that ties all together, and it's extremely fascinating to think about. So, can you talk about like how that is, and why he thought that?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot there. So I'll say, here's the foundation for that one is that the Pentateuch is narrative book, and so here's the idea, right? Is that whenever we see the Torah being discussed, especially in the New Testament, and even evidence of that in the Old Testament, they're always talking about the books of Moses or the book of Moses. And so there's always been this sense that it's a unity. It's always been a unity. So we know a couple things when we think about authorship, and you already mentioned JEDP, right? So we know that people have say all sorts of different things about who wrote it. But what we do know from at least the witness of Scripture is that Moses is part of this somehow. The New Testament looks at it as a unified whole. Now let's push that aside for now. Let's talk about this unified whole and what that ultimately means then. So let's say it is a unified work, whether it's written by Moses or it's about Moses. That's a different question. But let's talk about what that would mean, right? So here's the deal. If it's a unified work, that means that there's a purpose behind it, that it's not just 5 individual books. I think sometimes people tend to read it that way, that you got all the narratives in the first book, and then you get all the laws and all the snoozers. Later on, it picks up a little bit more, in part of it in Exodus, and then, Leviticus is typically, when we're starting our read the Bible through a year plan, we kind of stop around Exodus 20 after we've read the 10 Commandments, and we don't read, and then we're like, crud, now I'm in a Leviticus, and then we're back in Deuteronomy or Numbers now. Now we got the stories there. We get into the land, and then there we go, more laws again, and we got all this stuff about Moses and Deuteronomy. He's just talking, and we kind of just saw it's all the same stuff from the other books. So what's that all about? And so here's the thing. We need to step back and say that there's a purpose. What is the purpose behind? Now, here, I think some of the things that Sailhammer brings up is there's an obvious like literary strategy that ties the book together. So for instance, if you were to look at Genesis, Genesis has a literary strategy. First off, this literary strategy of just seeing that there are people that we're following that are all connected to each other. Like you're following the story of these people and who they are and where they came from. Like that's part of it. Just a storyline. But there's also things like the what is called the Toledot formula. Like these are the generations of, these are the records of. And so you see these genealogies that get placed throughout the narrative. And that's there to show those pieces. There's a unity behind that as well. So there's that. But one of the big things that he brings up, that he kind of says is another thing to show that it's all tied together as one unity, is there's these three major poetic sections that are brought up. And you'll see that one of them comes at the end of Genesis with Jacob. There's another one with Balaam. And then you have the final one with Moses. And all of those point towards some sort of eschatological future for Israel. And those are put in such a way to show that this is another unified work, that we're all pointing towards what's to come in the last days. And so those are some of the things that you begin to see. Like there's a strategy here that's going on that ties in this whole book together. And so that's one of the first things that he really points out and hits hard when we're talking about the unity of the Pentateuch, is that we're seeing not only this continuous storyline of these people, because it's not just here are these people and then here are these people, we don't know who these ones are, and they're just kind of individual stories. No, it's one family that gets tied all the way through. But then there's also these big kind of poetic sections that kind of bring it all together and tie it all together. And so that's another piece that shows that there's unity in that. There's also another piece to this as well, which he really fleshed it out in his final book, which is the meaning of the Pentateuch. That's like, I think, his 700-pager that he put out. And that's one that he deals with it here in the Pentateuch as narrative, but in the other one, he really does it. It is this strategy that we see that once we get to the laws, that it's not just a book about laws. It's not just a book that says, here's the narratives, and then boom, here's the laws. But it's a book that here are the narratives, and then it also seems like these laws are placed in relationship to the narratives. That you have some narratives, and then you have an incident, which then brings the laws, and then you pick up and you have an incident and a narrative, and those bring more laws too. And so you begin to see that maybe these laws aren't just here to be added on, but they're here to show us a story about the law, which is really an important point, Zach, and then I'll shut up and let you talk for a sec, which is this, is, you know, the Pentateuch, sometimes we equate the Pentateuch with the covenant, right? That it is the covenant. It's not the covenant. It's not the document of the covenant either. It contains aspects of the covenant. It contains the story of the old covenant made at Sinai, but it's not equated. It is not the covenant that is contained in Israel. And so it's the story of what happened when the covenant came. And you begin to start to see some really interesting things when you begin to look at and compare what it was like for Israel prior to the covenant, and then once the covenant is given, like what happens with the people once they're given laws. And then you get the other question, is, if you're going to follow this story, right, then what is the major point of the story? The major point is all of it seems to be getting to, let's get to Sinai. And once we get to Sinai, God makes that covenant with Israel, and he's going to give them the blessings of the land. And so in that relationship that he gives them, they will then inherit the blessings. And that's where you see things go off the rails very quickly once you get to Numbers as well. So not only do you have the incident of the golden calf right after the covenant's given, but you also see their failure to inherit the land, that first generation, because of their disobedience. And so land and covenant are tied together. It's a major theme. And so then that is something that plays into, okay, then what's Genesis all about then? If that's the story, if the story is about people getting to Sinai, getting the covenant, getting the land, then what's all this other stuff about? And that's what changed the game for me, is it is a story that you need to read all the parts together, right? That, like, no one picks up a novel And well, some people do, because and just start to say, okay, well, I'm just going to start in chapter 7, and who cares about the first 6 chapters? Well, you might need to know that the 6 chapters are pointing us to that, right? That are getting us ready for what's going to take place in that next chapter, and how it ends might also provide some resolution of what started. So an intro is a big deal. It sets up the scene of where this book is headed, and how it may end. So that's a little bit of a synopsis in terms of some of the unity of what we're looking for and what we're seeing when we talk about the unity of the Pentateuch.
Yeah, and we'll kind of talk about that more, as like what the purpose of the whole book of Genesis in general is.
You bet.
Selhammer, in his book, he talks about narrative typology, and this is where it really gets good and interesting. So there's all these different themes or matching places, and you gloss over it a couple of times and you probably wouldn't notice it, but then you really compare these different stories or characters, and it's like, oh wow, that is a lot of the same ideas happening. So can you talk about like all the different times that happens and all that?
Sure. Okay, so here's something. Narrative typology, here's something that's changing how I use this. But yeah, he talks about the idea that these are not just stories that are just there. Like the old way of talking, the critical way of looking at these stories was, that's one version, and then they put a new version in, and they just couldn't get their stories right, essentially, right? That there's essentially these competing stories, different traditions, and that's the whole idea of JEDP too, is that you have traditions in the north, traditions in the south, traditions of Deuteronomists and the priestly groups, and they have these different stories, and that's why we end up with some of this variation. But that's not what we're talking about, that these stories actually may point us to something greater that's going to take place. And so, one of the things he talks about is that these stories will foreshadow or anticipate later events in the Bible. And actually, can I tell you a game changer, a different way to think about it, to me, which, let me just say this too. So Selhammer is who I studied with. Another guy who he was about 2 ahead of me is Seth Postel, who wrote Adam for Israel. And one of the things I love about what Seth has written is he wrote this book after Adam with Israel, is Reading Moses, Seeing Jesus. And he brings a very Jewish perspective of how to understand narrative typology. And once I read that, it seems to click even more for me. The Jewish saying for how we would understand narrative typology is this phrase that says, the deeds of the father are signs to the sons. And he says this, that Moses wrote these stories about the patriarchs, not to tell us about the patriarchs and about those who preceded them, but also to tell us about what would happen to the descendants of those patriarchs, the nation of Israel, in the future. And so once you begin to understand that, then it begins to make sense. So like one of the first stories that when you begin to look at it, you're like, okay, why? Well, that's an interesting insight. So there's the story of Abraham as he goes into Egypt early in the narrative. So for instance, I'm trying to make sure I've got my Bible software open, and I'm just going to talk at you for a second. So Abraham gets called out, and then immediately after that, he goes down into Egypt in chapter 12. Now, here's what's interesting, right? So he goes down there. Of course, he passes Sarah off as his wife and or his sister. And then you find out that he takes him in. Pharaoh takes her in. And then it says this, that he treated Abraham well, gave her flocks. And then it says, the Lord struck Pharaoh and his household with severe plagues. And then after that, it says Pharaoh gave his men orders to take him out, and they sent him away with all that he had. My software here, right? So
there you
go. So like, here's the thing, right? So you'll see that he goes in, and some of this is just pretty basic, right? You'll see he goes in, he treats him well, and then you find out though at the very right here that you have these severe plagues, right? So like if you're to look and see even the word plagues, where it pops up, like these are the plagues. It's very interesting that you see that word used. Where is it used again? In 11, where there's going to be plagues brought down on Egypt as well. And so then he leaves, right? And he takes her, and he takes all the stuff that he had. But what happened? He acquired a ton of stuff in the process while he was in Egypt. And so you start to say, well, that's an interesting little story, right? That he goes down into Egypt, God will hit Pharaoh with plagues, and as a result, though, he will walk out with an abundance. We've heard that story before. Where is that story? That's the story of the Exodus, right? That they go down into Egypt. It foreshadows them going into Egypt, and then they will leave with an abundance. Because it says in the Exodus story that they asked everybody for all their items, and they were given. It says they plundered the Egyptians on their way out, and they came out with a multitude of items. So you're like, that's a really interesting story. That's where that takes place. Those kind of things. Now, where it gets really interesting is the stuff like what Pastel writes with Adam and Israel, right? Which is like that this story about Adam in the garden has a lot to do with Israel. And it foreshadows what would happen to Israel as well, a failure to keep the covenant. And in fact, that one actually is mentioned in Hosea, talks about how Adam didn't keep the covenant. You're like, what covenant? Where is that? And it's interesting that he's bringing up that parallel. But yeah, you begin to see things like Adam was supposed to subdue the land, and he didn't. And ultimately, you've got the serpent who comes in, and you see that too with Israel later on, where they're given the land to subdue it, and they don't. They leave certain peoples in there as well. Like there's all these little things, and a lot of that comes through, by the way, with word choice. Like some of this is easy to pick up just by in English, where you can see some of these parallels, just kind of major parallels between what happens to individuals. But some of these other ones become a little bit trickier, and it's through knowing the original languages that you begin to see, wow, there's a lot more going on there with those uses of words than we assumed. And so that's some of that stuff where you begin to see that narrative typology play out, is you're looking at these stories, and especially when there seems to be an echo of that story, or there seems to be another one of those play out, like they're not just there to show us this was what was going to happen to these people. No, they're there to show us that this is what happened to them, and this was going to happen again. And it's a sign for the people eventually, right? That this is what would happen to you as well. So you'll see things like that take place with the narrative typology.
So I'm just going to read from Pete Enns' article here. So it says, Adam is created by God at the Exodus through a cosmic battle. Adam is created in Genesis 2 after the taming of chaos in Genesis 1. Adam is placed in a lush garden. The Israelites are given Canaan to inhabit a lush land flowing with milk and honey. The Israelites, they remain in the land as long as they obey the Mosaic law. And then Adam and Eve, they're given the law not to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And then as a stipulation for remaining in the garden. And then Adam and Eve disobey the law, and they're exiled. Israel disobeys the law, they're exiled to Babylon. So Adam as Israel goes even greater detail, and so it's really super interesting parallels there. So like you kind of talked about it, like as far as do you think that the Genesis writer is kind of like speaking like prophetically, or do you think this is kind of like tied in by Moses at some point, or how do you think that all fits in? Like, is it prophetic? Is it on purpose, accidental?
All of these, what the typology involved? Yeah. So this comes back down to when you think it's written, and so my view of the Pentateuch's authorship is I believe that it's mostly Mosaic. However, I do think that it's finished much later in the time of of Israel's history. I kind of take a view that just it's comfortable to me. I know others have said, maybe it was the guy who wrote Chronicles, the prophet who wrote Chronicles. To me, I'd like to think maybe Ezra had a hand at this. But what seals the deal for me on who wrote, or at least finished and edited the work, because I think that's what we're looking at, right? Not necessarily redaction, criticism, but like who took the final form and put the stories together, right? Because I think Moses is there writing a lot of this stuff out. I think he's got a lot of these stories. I think that you've got a lot of these stories that are being passed down from generation to generation. I think the genealogical records are being passed down as well. So I think Moses has sat with a lot of stuff, but I think at the end of the line, towards the close of right at the return of exile, you probably have someone who's finishing the work finally. Whether that, I don't know how much he had in placing it all together, or he's got the book. Obviously we know even in the Torah you've got references to the book of the wars of the Lord. I think Joshua mentions like the book of Jasher. Like there are these records books, and it's the same thing in Kings. If you want to know the rest of these, look at the annals of the kings of Judah, or look at the annals of the kings of Israel. Like there are these books that used to exist that are no longer there, and it seems like they were incorporated into the work. So I tend to take the view that that at some point towards the end, at the end of the exile return, somebody like an Ezra, a prophetic individual, comes and kind of finally pieces it all together and organize it. And part of that is the way that the chapter ends, right? So to me, what really seals that is when you look at the end of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy focuses on this individual who was to come, and so I'll show it up if you want. I'll put the screen share on that. Like this is one of my favorite passages too, by the way, is this right here. So Deuteronomy closes by saying that no prophet has arisen again in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. He was unparalleled for all the signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do against the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and all his officials and all his land, and for the mighty acts of power and the terrifying deeds that Moses performed in the sight of Israel. So here's the deal, right? Obviously, Moses didn't write his death chapter. And so what is this talking about? Now, some people say, well, that just means that, somebody maybe like a Joshua came and wrote this. But the problem is with something like that, right, is no prophet is getting risen in Israel like Moses. Well, if Joshua takes it and writes this last chapter, well, whoop-de-doo, it's been like, it's been like a year, it's been like 2 years, there hasn't been much time for a guy like Moses to arise. But there's even more so interesting information that pops up. And this is what you see in Deuteronomy 18. And this is where God tells Moses, he says this, Deuteronomy 18:15, the Lord your God will raise up a prophet like me from among your brothers. You must listen to him. This is what you requested from the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, when you said, let us not continue to hear the voice of the Lord our God or see the great fire any longer, so that we will not die. Now that's an interesting one too. We talk about what happened at Sinai and the giving of the law, and that's a fun one to look at. But when the Lord said to me, they have spoken well, I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers, and I'll put my words in his mouth, and he will tell them everything I've commanded him. I will hold accountable whoever does not listen to my words that he speaks in my name. So that is what Moses is pointing to, right? The end of the Torah, it says that we're waiting for that guy to come, and he's not here yet. And so to me, that those words at the end of Deuteronomy 34 give us insight that this is, to me, how much more so if that's at the close of Israel's history, so to speak, at the end of the exile return, that we're still waiting for this guy who will be better than Moses, who will be like Moses, who the New Testament picks up and says that's Jesus. It's very clear they talk. I mean, it's interesting. You look at the book of John, and they're talking to John the Baptist, like, are you Elijah? No. Are you the prophet? No. And they're meaning, are you that guy? Because they're still waiting for him. And I think the book closes by saying we're waiting for him to arrive. Then that gives me reason to believe that that's a much later editorializing, completing, finishing of the work done by somebody, I think, saying he's not here yet, but we're waiting for him to come. So that's kind of my view on when it was written, how it had to be finished. And so that being said, is I think the work that we're looking at is something that has a lot more intelligent design than simply something that's just been thrown together. I think that we're seeing somebody who at the end of it has had time to kind of process it and work through it. I mean, here's another thing we have to think about in terms of an overall design and shape for the Pentateuch. The original language in which the Pentateuch was written in is not the same script that we have today, right? So the script that the Pentateuch that we have that comes down from like, the Masoretic text, it's not the same as it would have been. In fact, that seems to be the case too, that the Hebrew might have even been different. When Ezra's there reading the Torah, or what's part of that, right? The law, they're having to have people translate it and tell it to them. And so, somebody at some point had to come and take what was there and just bring it into the more modern biblical Hebrew that we have today as well. And so all of that kind of points me to that there was a hand that kind of ties this together and brings it together and uses these stories and puts them all there. Now, could most of that have been Moses? Absolutely, most of that could have been Moses. In fact, I think most of it is Moses. But I do think at the end, there is somebody who's come in and kind of fashions it and ties it all together where it's one really set work. And I think that's somebody like an Ezra or somebody who wrote Chronicles.
So,
but does that answer the question, or I just run off on authorship, man?
No, that's definitely part of it. So something that I struggled with, that I had really had to think through when I first read Seth Pastel's book, is that he, he makes all these parallels, and it's like, okay, if those, if you typically write a story, you're not going to just a general. If I just decided to write some biography or autobiography or whatever about my life, I'm not going to say, like, I'm not going to be making all these parallels to someone else or whatever. It's just going to be just typically it's just going to be random details. But it seems like these themes are kind of almost picked out. And my question for you is, do you think that it was like added, or just maybe the words changed a little bit, so the themes were already there, but the words were two words that have the same meaning, like in bara and asa. So one, it could be like make, create, in Genesis 1. So like maybe the original story has something like asa, and then the writer comes along, or Ezra, whoever, says, and when we're writing Exodus, we can change it just a little bit, change the words, not the meaning or what the extra story says, but just the words, make them connect so that it's way easier to see the point. Or maybe that's just heresy, who knows? What do you think about that?
I mean, so a lot of that has to come down to your view of how a text comes together, right? So I think, I don't think there's tweaking involved. Now, look, granted, I say, obviously we see updates in a text, right? So you'll see places like, I think one of the big ones is in Genesis. It talks about Abraham going to Dan, and you're like, wait a second, that's Dan's not even there in land, because that's what is that? That's a great grandson of his, right? So that's not even, and then that's prior to them ever going into the land to know where Dan would have settled. And so that's their updates. It's the same thing, I think, when you get into late versus early date of the Exodus timeline too. Pate and Ramses, like, are those the original names of those cities, or were they updated to tell the updated audience what those places were? So I definitely see, and I think you can allow for that to take place. I think I don't know, man. I don't know if, in terms of language, in terms of verbiage and things like that, I think, part of me thinks that was just there. Those narratives, they're unified. Sailhammer says there's what is it? There's a clear unity with a, what does he say? I'm going to quote it right here. He says, discernible unity with a noticeable lack of uniformity at these units, right? So there's all these units placed together. I don't know how much word choice has to be tweaked. Obviously, when you go from an older version into a newer version, you're going to have to tweak some of that and to make those words. But I don't know how much. So I don't know how much I can speak to that in terms of what was tweaked or what was updated. But what we do know is what we have is in a final form. So the final form of the text is this is what it is. And so that's what we get to deal with, is not what it might have been or what it was at what stage. We're dealing with what does this final form show us at this stage. It's the final stage of the text. And so we know that those words are there and there are distinctions on purpose. And so I think that's the best way to deal with it is, could it have been? It might have, but what the final text gives us are those distinctive verbs.
Yeah, totally. That makes a lot of sense. And of course, it's in that regard, it's a lot of speculation.
Yeah.
So I definitely would never make any hard stance on any of that.
But a lot of people do. I mean, that's the thing is a lot of people,
Yeah.
and when you start reading stuff too, it's like people are they're making hard stances on speculations. That's part of what it is you're like, wow, you're really putting a lot into that. And that's not really all that there. You got a point you want to make, and it's easily disagreeable. So some people do that though.
Yeah, for sure. So something that really stood out to me, and you talked about this previously, is how in Genesis 26:5 it says, Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. And my question for you is, like, how is it possible for Abraham to obey the commandments, statutes, and laws before they were given? Because Abraham's obviously before Moses.
Yeah. So that's a fascinating line, right? Because you're looking at it like, there is no law. What law was it? And so the easiest way people say, well, that's just him, just whatever God would have told him as he went along. Like that's what that's all about. But I don't think that's what really that's about, right? I think that the idea that Abraham, obeyed God's laws is showing us something that the text as a whole is pointing out, right? So that here's what is interesting, right? Is you have somebody like an Abraham who, he lives prior to the law, and yet it says about him that he did obey all of God's laws. But you guess what? You get the other guy who didn't obey it all and actually doesn't make it into the land, and that's Moses. And so I think there is a highlighting here of the fact that Moses had the law. Moses was part of giving the law, and he doesn't make it into the promised land. And yet Abraham, it says that he did obey those laws. And I think what the point is, it's the same thing that we see that in Genesis 15, where it says that Abraham believed the Lord and it was counted to him as righteousness, right? And so that's part of what I think the kind of the strategy is, where you say you kind of put these pieces together. So he believes, and his faith is credited to him as righteousness. And then at the end of his life, it says that he obeyed the laws and the commands. And I think that's kind of, you're supposed to put those together. You're supposed to read those together. I know that that seems to be what we're supposed to do, is we're supposed to read his life alongside Moses. In fact, Sailhammer says in page 71 of the Pentateuch as narrative, he says, the author uses the life of Abraham, not Moses, to illustrate the one who can fulfill the righteous requirements of the law. In choosing Abraham and not Moses, right? Because if you would think of somebody who was supposed to keep the laws and was faithful, you'd think Moses, he's the one who brought the commands, but that's not what happens, right? He says in choosing Abraham and not Moses, the author shows that the keeping of the law means believing in God, just as Abraham believed God and was counted righteous. And in fact, the author says, be like Abraham, live a life of faith, and it can be said that you are keeping the law. So I think that's a pretty fascinating statement. And I think that's where you begin to get into something else I think is really worth looking at, is if the whole of the Torah is about just keep the law and you will be okay, that what the God of the Old Testament really wants is a people to just read all the laws and keep all the laws and be faithful in all of his laws, then why is it that we have the first book of the five, the introduction to the five, where people are walking with God? They know him, they spend time with him, they've seen him. And that's a whole nother one, man. I love the conversation about a theophany in the Old Testament, those people who get to experience him. And then the law is given. And once the law comes, guess what? It's very different now. And it seems to be people are way more prone to fail since the law. It seems like they just continue to get worse. So what's up with that? A book about the importance of keeping the law seems to have a really bad story about how people actually can't. And it's the people without the law who had it better. And I think that's another insight of what the Pentateuch is trying to show us, though, that there's this faith that it takes to walk with the Lord, this belief that it takes to walk with the Lord is what will matter. And these laws are not going to be the things that save you. And that's fleshed out, I think, a little bit more, too, in the Reading Moses, Seeing Jesus book. That's a great one. And Sailhammer deals with that in his Meaning of the Pentateuch book, where he begins to tie in the strategy of the way even that the laws are given in the Old Testament. Like, this is something to really think through. Like, have you thought about why laws come at where they do in the Old Testament? Like, it bothered rabbis to say, if the book was all about law, why is it that we have all of this narrative prior to the giving of the law? And it's interesting to note that it seems to be, and Sailhammer picks up on this in his Pentateuch's narrative, he has these little charts where it seems to be that the strategy of from Exodus through Deuteronomy seems to be that you have a covenant that's made with Israel, and then you have the stipulations, then you have failure, right? And then you have a bunch of laws that are given as a result of that failure, and then you have a renewal, and then you have an event that shows their failure, and then even more laws are given. And so laws seem to be added on after every instance of failure of the people. And so it seems to show that God is having to give them more because they keep refusing to obey. Their hearts are so hard that they keep refusing to obey, to where you get to the very end of Deuteronomy. And I love how Deuteronomy ends, where in 30, right, that he talks about that he's going to have to circumcise their hearts in order that they would love him and obey him. And because the law has failed. It's not. So for a work that's just about obey the law and keep the law, it's a really bad work for that. But it's a really good one to say, hey, man, this is going to fail at some point. And man, we wait for the day that the Lord will circumcise our hearts and change us all as a people too.
Wonderfully said. Yeah. So Sailhammer talks about Genesis. It has an emphasis on land, which is obviously super weird. I talked about Ben Stanhope, somewhat famous YouTuber. He made a Facebook post the past few months, and he's like, when you look at the Old Testament, and obviously Genesis as well, it's like almost half of the whole thing is spent talking about dirt, like just land, and it's like that's weird. But obviously there's a cultural context to that, but Genesis definitely makes an emphasis on land. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So, okay, here's the game changer for me. When you begin to see that it's a unified storyline, that there's something that's going on that's tying it all the way through, then you have to go back and you inevitably have to understand Genesis in light of that, right? Because I think sometimes we read Genesis divorced from the other four. But if it's all one storyline, then let's start with that. So what is the thing Sailhammer always taught us to do is say, find the center point. What's the center of the Torah? Well, the center point, where the climax is of the narrative, is the giving of the law and the blessings of the land. That's interesting. So go back to the very beginning. And it becomes very interesting to note that the word that is used whenever we talk about earth It's the same word that is used of the promised land. And so that's the first thing got my wheels spinning, because I can't unsee that. Because the problem is, you and I, we read from a very modern kind of perspective. When we think of the heavens and the earth was formless and void, we tend to think of what we're looking at is from that satellite image of this planet. But that's not what they had in mind either. And in fact, if the whole book is about you're going to this good land where I'm going to bless you, a land flowing with milk and honey, and then you start your book by talking about that land, that's really interesting. I think that we do a disservice sometimes in our English translations, that we just kind of chalk it up to, we just call it earth, right? Because look, here's the other thing. Early earth, use of earth when it was translated into English was dirt and land. But now the way we understand earth is a completely different context. But when you actually begin to read it in the original language and you see earth, i.e. promised land, you begin to read it, what you begin to find is it seems to be that this story is now not about, let me tell you the whole story of the earth. Let me tell you the story of the promised land. Now that's fascinating to me, because here's what else it gets really interesting, right? Is it does appear that once you get into, I think it's chapter 2, when we get into the, where is that? I took notes today. I was going through the Sailhammer's other book, Genesis Unbound. When you get into that one, you start to notice that the rivers that are mentioned as the rivers for where the Garden of Eden is are very similar with the extent of the promised land given in Genesis 15. And so that's interesting too. And then you notice that when people leave, they're going eastward. And when people go eastward, it's always eastward towards Babylon. That's the kind of symbolic, going east is going into exile into Babylon, and they eventually end up there at the Tower of Babel. And so it all kind of points to this similar story, that now there is this land that has been formed in 1 and in 2. And what seems to be even more interesting is the land is formed in 1 and 2, and there's a lot of parallels with what that land is, with temple imagery, with tabernacle imagery. When you begin to start to look at even more, you begin to start to notice that some of the stuff that Adam's supposed to do is very similar with some of the priestly imagery too. Now, that's one of the things I think is kind of interesting about where Walton comes out. Now, Walton's coming from using ancient Near Eastern context to kind of provide some context for how to understand this. But when you just look at the words and see the text in general, you begin to see that, like, man, we've seen some of this imagery in the tabernacle before. Here's another one that should be a clear insight, right? When God kicks Adam and Eve out of the garden, he places 2 cherubim. Well, what marks the veil to go into the tabernacle, into the Holy of Holies? It's 2 cherubim. And so you begin to see all these images, especially when you get into the Solomon's temple. That's got garden imagery all over it. But you begin to see that kind of stuff, and you say, okay, I can't unsee that now. And one of the things I like that Seth Postel brings up is he kind of makes a distinction a little bit more, is that it seems to be that, that what we have in chapter 1 is kind of the whole promised land. Now, Sailhammer seems to say that it's 1 and 2 are just talking about the land in general. Postel seems to look and say that we're looking at the land, but we're also looking, the garden is more of, like, the promised land is more of the outer court of the tabernacle, and the garden is the tabernacle itself, that there's parallels in all of that. I think that's quite interesting there. But that opens up a lot of other questions, Zach, about then if we're only focused on the promised land, then what does that mean for everything else? What does that mean about how we read Genesis? And I'll tell you what, that was somewhat freeing to me, because I grew up kind of feeling torn between old earth, young earth. And I think that that's the longest of how I always kept thinking of Genesis. I kind of thought, oh, I know Genesis, it's young earth, or oh, I know Genesis, it's progressive creationism. I kind of read it only from that scientific perspective. But once you read it from a literary perspective, and you say, man, chapters 1 and 2 really tie with what God is doing. He's creating a space in which he wants to live amongst his people. Even when he says he places them in the garden, we sometimes translate it as, to work and to keep the garden, but that's not what it may actually mean. It may mean that is to worship and obey. It's the same words for those too. And so you begin to see that, maybe what this story is about is that God created this land in which he was going to reside amongst his people. He walks in the garden. And he really gives them the greatest of all conditions, right? You've got one rule. Don't eat from the tree. And they blow it. And I think that's some more of that Adam as Israel parallel that we have to notice. In the greatest of conditions, humanity blows it in the garden. They are kicked out and exiled. Similarly, Israel will go to the land and they will enjoy the land, and they blow it and they will go in exile. So much so that the future is that they're so screwed up that God has to do a new work in their life and circumcise their hearts. But that is what I think is absolutely going on, is chapters 1 and 2 are pointing us to the promised land, that this is God's focus on the land. And I actually think that fits perfectly with the close of our complete canon. Instead of seeing a garden, we now see a Jerusalem come down. You got two people in the garden with God. Now you have a city with millions upon millions of those who have followed Christ, who live with him and live amongst him with his own people. So I think that fits. But what starts in the garden is lost due to sin, going to exile, and then it's about getting back and restoring those blessings. And we seem to think that we're about to get it in Sinai, and they blow it once again by actually refusing to have that relationship with God. Chapter 20 and 21 of Exodus reveal that the people actually said, we don't want to go up to the mountain and be with you, God. We have somebody else go between us and be our intermediary. And so God was going to make them like Adam again, to be priest-like, to get to experience him. And as a result, no, they became a people, a kingdom with priests instead of a kingdom of priests. And so there they are. They have laws and they have stipulations, and they will go and they will also blow it just like Adam and Eve did. So help with some of the kind of what we're thinking about when we think about the garden and the land.
Oh yeah, no, that was great. Great little summary there.
Man, I'll tell you what, this was the one that was the one that like blew my mind, because that's what I started with. I started in that Genesis class with him, and that was like, I'd never heard that before ever in my life. And when you get out of, is it old earth, young earth, all of the science stuff, you're like, wow, I can just like read the text and see what it actually says. I'm not imposing a system on it. That is a game changer, where we can just see it for what the text says and not, oh, I got to make sure I see the science add up. And I'll say this is what I think the greatest values I think of Sailhammer to this is, Sailhammer was all about your focus on the text, keeping your focus on the text. These questions of is it old earth, is it young earth, those are apologetic questions, and they're good questions. I want to know, how does my Bible relate to the world around me? I want to know, do I see some of this stuff rooted in science? But the reality is, often science is changing too. I mean, the scientific method by nature should be, you should be testing and seeing where we come up, and there should be tweaks going on, but the Word of God doesn't change. And so what I should do is try to focus, put blinders on, keep my focus on what does the world of the text show me about this book, and read it from that perspective. Don't bring all that other stuff in, but eventually later on I can say, okay, well, where does current scientific consensus leave us right now, and does it fit with the world of the Bible? That's what I think should be the practice. That was something that he drilled into all of his students, is the text is it. The text is all you need. But those other questions are not irrelevant. They're for apologetic purposes. They're not for interpretive purposes, though.
And sometimes when you get in those discussions, it's like, all right, this is super serious. It's like, this is God's word we're talking about. Like, we don't want to impose our thinking, our, what we want it to be. But just let's worry about the Bible here, and then let that make our conclusions based off that. So, Yeah,
I think
that's fascinating.
that's the
Mm-hmm.
best way to go forward though is because I don't know, I feel like, when it comes to a text-centered approach that um you can get into a lot of different interpretations depending on your starting point, right? So if I want to read science into it, I'm going to tweak it to kind of make it fit. But the problem is that what happens when that view changes? It's the same thing that you see in a lot of ways that people approach the work from a historical perspective or an archaeological perspective, especially in the critical days, right? So like I preached through the book of Daniel about a year and a half ago. And in the old days, people would say, well, okay, now we know that these stories are not real. There is no such thing as Belshazzar, and we don't even really know and have records of these people. And then what do you know? We dig it up and we find out, oh yeah, and he was co-regent with his father, Nabonidus, which makes a lot of sense of like when he's telling Daniel, hey, if you can read the writing on the wall, I'll give you up to a third of the kingdom, because he can't give away he can't give up to half his kingdom because he doesn't have half the kingdom that he belongs to. Like, so there's some of those things as well that people are so quick to say, oh, we know from science, or we know from archaeology, or for the text. Like, I think we should not build a foundation on those things. We should build a foundation on the context of the text. And we have a unified work. We can see how the words work, the way that Moses used those works, or whoever used those words, and how they told those stories. And let that be the foundation for, you want to know what he means by that word? Well, let's use the text for that. Or let's even expand that to the entire canon of the Old Testament. How they use those words. I think understanding what the condition of the land at the very beginning is, that you need to go and look and see, like, isn't it interesting that the prophets talk about the land after God is going to wipe it out, that he's going to call it formless and void. And of course, the gap theorists come in and say, see, it's formless and void because God had there's a wiping out of the land. I don't think that's what it means. I think that they're saying we're going to wipe this land out to where it's going to be uninhabitable like it used to be before God created, the promised land and focused in on the promised land for his people.
Yeah, of course. I like that. Of course, Walton uses that as kind of. Are you referring to Jeremiah 4 by chance?
I don't know. I can't remember which one I'm thinking of. There's a couple. Let me find out.
Well, Jeremiah 4 has the tohu vabohu language, as it's the. I can't remember. Israel, I think, is destroying.
You're right.
Yeah.
Jeremiah 4:23 and 20 through 26 is the tohu vabohu.
Yeah. So, Greg Davidson in his book. I don't know if Seth Bostel and Selhammer make that point. Maybe they do, but Greg Davidson in his book with Kenneth Turner, Manifold Beauty of Genesis, they make that point that, like, same verbiage using. But this refers to land, as Genesis 1 is typically think of as water, but you have that similarity there. And it's like, what's going on? So when we look at the Jewish writings, and the Talmud, and writers after the Old Testament, second intertestamental period, Second Temple period, all that kind of stuff. We don't, or from what I know of at least, we don't really see that the writers of that time period are noticing these kind of like parallels between the land of Genesis and the promised land. And some scholars have said, oh, well, if they're not going to make that connection, we must be looking at it, 3,000-4,000 years later or whatever, thinking, oh, we're just seeing things in it that aren't actually there. So do you think that's a fair criticism, or like, why do you think that they might not have seen those kind of things?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've actually not ever thought much about that idea of of the way that it's translated or way that it's understood. There might be an aspect of that to where, obviously, view of the world probably plays into that a little bit too, especially when you look at what took place during the intertestamental period, where you begin to get Greek influence, where maybe they are starting to think of things in terms of maybe kind of the way that we've kind of always been thinking about it, right? Scientifically, or we're thinking about it philosophically, or certain views. So I don't know. Maybe that is part of that, right? That maybe that is part of what maybe that next generation would have thought, or that maybe they were influenced in some way, not seeing it that way. I'm actually even scanning right now, looking, because trying to look at see does he I think he deals with this in his, what is it, Genesis Unbound thing. But the other thing I would say is that Sailhammer was always just really good with well, does the text affirm this? Okay, well, good, right? Like in some respect, that whether that was maintained or lost is not necessarily indicative that that it was the that it's the veracity of a certain view. But actually I'm looking here too right now, as because he's got this discussion, because you can edit however you want to edit this, but I'm looking at 2014, page 214 on his Genesis Unbound. Now, granted, this is the older version. They had a reprint that came out later on, so I'm not sure what the page numbers on that one is. But right here, he says, at least later on with Rashi, who was the medieval rabbi, he said, medieval Jewish commentator Rashi understood most of the account of Genesis 1 as a direct reference to God's preparation of the promised land. Rashi gave much thought to the reason Genesis and the Pentateuch as a whole would begin with the account of creation of the promised land. As usual, his answer was insightful and betrayed a vast appreciation for the purpose of Scripture. So it seems like maybe you get Rashi in on that, but yeah, not much out after that. So yeah, I don't know why you wouldn't see that, but there's at least somebody later on in Jewish thought who did that. But I do think that that's probably a reason why, is people are looking at the way that they read the world around them, and how does that fit in. So that's probably something to it. But that's a terrible long answer for such a short one I could have given.
No worries. No, I definitely relate to that, as far as when the 21st century viewer, we read Genesis 1, Genesis 1 to 11, and all that kind of stuff, and we're reading it as God created the planets and the whole entire circular globe, and it's the ancient Israelite would not have seen it like that. So a lot of people say, okay, maybe this is God inspired, this is how God wrote it. Well, that's fine, but the ancient Israelite wouldn't have read it that way. And if the ancient Israelite wouldn't have read that way, why would we expect the land, the focus on land, to be seen, and up until the time when they talk about when scientific views start to change, where I don't know the exact timetables, but at some point you have views of the world, scientific views that you're talking about changing. So I don't know, maybe that plays into it there.
It's a good objection for sure. It just, do we see evidence of that, of other people talking about it? But it's an interesting objection.
Yeah, I think the strongest point there is that when they use the same words, and you already know it's the same. Yeah, sure, maybe the writer uses the same words, but when you have specific words in a group only used at certain points, specifically when you talk about day 3, when the waters are separated to form land, and then the Exodus account when they're crossing the Red Sea, the exact same words are used, and that it doesn't seem like a coincidence. So something else here. So Genesis 1:2 and Genesis 1:9 make it clear that there was no dry ground at all until day 3. Mm-hmm. But you're saying that, okay, well, at the very beginning, Genesis 1:1 or even 1-3, it's talking about almost referring to the promised land. So what do you think there?
So, okay, so I did actually today, I was going back over my Genesis Unbound text. And I'll say this, the way the Sailhammer described it was Genesis 1:1 is totality. Everything's already created. The entire universe is done in 1:1. He would even throw into there plants, animals, the trees, all that kind of stuff. The world is spinning, essentially. The universe is created. That once we get to verse 2, though, we're not focused on everything. Here, you and I were talking Star Wars just a little bit ago. And this is kind of like in the Star Wars movies where they all start out with that big expanse of space. And then all of a sudden, the camera continues to zoom in, and it's usually on some ship or something like that, or some planet or whatnot. And that's essentially what's happening here is we've gone from entire totality of the entire universe to now we're focusing on one small piece of real estate on the entire globe. So everything is kind of spinning and happening around, except now once we pick into verse 2, we're talking about this uninhabitable piece of property that God is going to choose to make habitable for mankind. And this is an interesting thing because this is where I think there's some room for disagreement. Where I have with him, I'm not completely sold on it, but he sees the world as spinning, and he even has a quote in here. He says that the word Bereshit translates in the beginning, tells us that God created the universe over a period of time, not a single instance. He says the length of period of time is not specified. It could have been as long as 1 billion years or as short as a few days or years. Given what appears to be true about the age of the earth, it's unlikely that millions or billions of years it's likely that millions or billions of years transpired during this time of the beginning. When my children ask me where the dinosaurs fit into the biblical account, I tell them they were created, lived, and became extinct during the beginning. And so for him, that's ultimately, I guess, his own apologetic view of the age of the earth, all of that. He was an old earth guy and saw that it was perfectly legitimate to say that the world has these animals and dinosaurs, everything, and it's spinning. But at some point, God begins to say, now I'm going to focus on this one spot. And he does make a great case that the creation of man is distinct from everything else, that all this other stuff is there. He's just, it's there. He's forming some of these things for the land, it seems, to make sure that it's in the land when the people go and get in there. But there is a big difference of man. So man is first created in the image of God. He is ruling over everything. And then he makes a big point to say that notice that in the genealogies that follow, that mankind from Adam goes and spreads out into all the rest of the known earth, meaning that we're not seeing that this is just a story about Israel and only Israel, and that there were other humans and the world is spinning on, and it's just a story about that. No, that the world is spinning on, and God chose to make it this place where life is teeming and growing. And maybe you've had, if you're an old earth person, this is what you're seeing, is that you've had ages upon ages of these creatures. And then boom, though, now God says, I'm going to change what I'm going to do. I'm going to start focusing. I'm going to make these people who will live amongst me. And I do it. And I'm going to use this little spot on this planet as where I'm going to do it. And it's uninhabitable right now, but I'm going to make it a place of beauty and a place where it's completely habitable. And so I think there's some room to disagree about how much is happening. I think it's perfectly legitimate for you to read the text. Like he even says, and you could say in the beginning, from verse 1 to verse 2, it could be a second, it could be billions of years, right? I think there's some flexibility in the text for that. I think you could say even too, I think you could even read the text to say that while we're focused on the promised land, these things are all happening in the world around. I think it's legitimate to say that maybe it's not just that these things are being created for this piece of real estate, but that as he's doing it, it's happening all over the globe as well. But I think he has an interesting perspective that we're not concerned about the rest of the globe. We're concerned about just this spot. But mankind is distinct and different in the text for sure. Not just one of many in the world.
Yeah, no, that's very fascinating. That's not something I've thought about a lot about. He's got a very particular view on things, something that it's almost like outside looking in, like, oh, you wouldn't have caught that typically.
Yeah.
But one of those things just makes you just want to sit and think about. That's about all I have for you there, Ben. I appreciate you coming on. Is there anything else you wanted to add as far as just like final points or summary of like what key things, what's the Pentateuch about?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big takeaway that I've always had from studying with Sailhammer is that some of those steps, right? Of I'm reading a work that's not 5. I mean, it was divided up for scroll space. So let's remember that. In fact, the titles, if they were meant to be unified works, the titles are literally like the first word on the page, right? That's what those titles are in the original language. And so they didn't really think of titles. They weren't unified, like they weren't distinct books. They were all one that were divided up for space. But you have to begin to think about the book as, okay, what is the book telling me from the start? And what is the book telling me to the end? And I think it's interesting when you begin to look. One of the things I love that, like I said, when you talk about this world, right, of Sailhammer, you have to look at some of those who have gone after him, who have picked up the mantle, so to speak. And I think a big one is Seth Postel, who has done that. And I love the fact that as he's writing in his Reading Moses, Seeing Jesus book, that he really picks up what Sailhammer began to point to, which is, you begin to see that not only do we have these people living by faith, and we see the failure of the law, but we begin to see these special eschatological pictures that develop, right? You begin to see the poem of the poetic speech of Jacob, which is in 49. You see those oracles of Balaam in 23, Numbers 23 through 24, and then the songs of Moses, Deuteronomy 32, 33. And you see that each one of them has this focus on what's going to happen in the last days. And there's this very, messianic look to what's coming down, this kingly individual who is coming. So there's, to me, that's a whole nother thing that just blows my mind when you begin to look, is that we're no longer looking at a document that tells us about law and keep these laws, follow these laws, but we're seeing people who fail to ever keep the law. And high points within that are these future works that God is going to do. Not only is he going to, circumcise the hearts of the people, but you're going to see that there's a king coming, and he'll be the greatest king of all. And we also see this prophet coming, who will be like Moses. And all those themes are tied uniquely and beautifully in the person of Jesus at the end. That once we see in the New Testament, though. And so I think that's one of the things that's really freeing about this, is if you begin to actually look at it as a unified work, you catch on very quickly that this is not a story about go keep the law, which I think most people think of the Pentateuch, right? Is go keep the law. And I think that's where you lead to discussions of people saying, we need to unhitch from it, because they misunderstand the point. It's not a point to tell you. It's not a document that says, here's all the laws, and God wanted all these people to read all these laws and follow these laws. But it's a story about people's inability to keep the law, and how God would have to rescue them and change them as a result, because they couldn't do it themselves. And even in the greatest of conditions in the garden with Adam, it was unobtainable. But there's a glimmer of hope, right? You walk with the Lord, you have faith, and you're seen as righteous. You're seen as keeping the law in total. And so I think that's the big thing, is right. The big takeaway for me is we got to read it as a unified whole find that center. Where is this going? And then find those little pieces that show us, man. And the ultimate end is to point us to not only our inability to keep it, but that God was going to do a work to fix that at the end. And that's like, wow. You're talking about when Paul starts talking about the gospel, he starts talking about the law as our school teacher. You're like, where is he coming up with this stuff? He's not coming up with it. He's just reading the Torah. I mean, that to me is incredible to think. And that to me is another thing. It's like, man, my faith is not something that like, here's the Old Testament and then boom, oh, we got Jesus and all the New Testament stuff. Like, no, we have the Old Testament that's always been pointing to the fact that you can never keep the law yourself and God has to do a work to save you. And what do you know? It's the same in the New Testament as well. And it's part 2 where he does the work. So to me, that's what's freeing about reading it this way, seeing it this way. And I do think, I don't think I can ever unsee it now. But man, there's so much more. When you start talking about the Pentateuch, especially Genesis, my problem that I run into, Zach, when I teach the Pentateuch at college level is we usually have like 16 weeks to do this. And my problem is sometimes I spend like 8 weeks in Genesis alone. And it's all the stories are there, but there's just so much that you're dealing with. It's just a massive, massive topic. But I think a good overview, a good snapshot where we're going, where it's all headed to, and seeing it all tie together. It's a unified work. There's a purpose that the author is trying to show. Whether it was Moses or a final editor, he's putting these and shaping these together because he wants us to get somewhere. And he wants us to focus on details. Last thing I guess I would liken it to is, you have to, I think for a lot of people, we have to think of it in the same way that we would think of like a really good movie, where there's details in a story where you're noticing these things are all here. And the first time through, you just you think the story is interesting, but you don't realize that everything that director has put in that is there for a reason. Why? I think one of the people who's masterful at this is M. Night Shyamalan. And, and this is, Trevor Longman was the first one to kind of put this analogy. And this comes to how we see Jesus in the Old Testament, that once you have the reveal, then you go and see all the parts there. But I think that same thing works in just saying, here's how you read the Old Testament. You recognize that every detail's there for a reason. The words are there for a reason. And you might gloss through it and jump through it every now and then, but you need to go back and realize like that they've put this shot this way. They've penned it this way for a reason. It's all details. It's never unnecessary. It is there to craft a story. So pay attention to the details. Pay attention to the parallels. You will be blown away in what you see when you begin to notice those connections as well. That's all I got, man. That's it.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you coming on here. I hope everyone enjoyed. I did for sure. Is there anything, do you have like a YouTube, any other places that we can check you out or follow you and want to share?
So for sure. So I have my own that I primarily do for my church, Royal Palms Pastor. It's called Theological Sidebars, if you look at that on YouTube. But what I do mainly is Dr. Andrew Marquez. He is a New Testament PhD, and he and I get together once a week with a channel we call the OTXNT. I also ripped that off of Sailhammer. That was his Gmail that he used to have. Old Testament, Christ, New Testament. And so we have what's called the OTXNT channel. You can find us there. We usually are uploading stuff that, whether that's devotionals or it's our once a week take on whether it's a theological topic. And both of us are pastors as well as in academia. And so we just kick around topics that are dealing with the church or with something that we want to take on that's theological. And and I'll tell you this, it's one of the things that we like to do is similar to what your point is, right? Is that there's so many things that you don't necessarily get a chance to talk like this in a regular Sunday morning service. And so it's kind of an outlet for us to say, we're not trying to hide anything. We want our church people to know of these discussions. We just don't necessarily, that's the Sunday morning pulpit's not necessarily a venue for that. So we try different ways. And that's one of the ways that we do it is through OTXNT.
Well, Ben, I hope you have a great rest of your day. I appreciate you coming on, and hope to talk to you later.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I loved it.
Awesome.